The ambient air temperature at the Monterey paddock was exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit at 8:14 in the morning, a cool coastal baseline that did nothing to lower the rising thermal output of Richard Sterling's ego. Richard, the chief executive officer of Apex Global Investments, stood beside his $4.2 million Apollo 512 hypercar, a vehicle composed entirely of exposed, book-matched carbon fiber and performative aggression. He was not simply standing, he was holding court, ensuring that the assembly of junior executives and venture capitalists surrounding him absorbed the total financial dominance radiated by the machine. The Apollo was a testament to purchase status, boasting an advertised horsepower of 1,200 and a top speed that none of its owners possessed the technical competence to achieve. Less than 40 feet away, entirely ruining the meticulously curated aesthetic of Richard's staging area, sat an oxidized, asymmetrical mass of stamped steel that had originally been manufactured as a 1993 Volvo 240 station wagon. Its exterior was a mosaic of primer patches, sun-faded blue paint, and visible weld lines, crouching mere inches above the asphalt on wheels that appeared to have been salvaged from a discontinued industrial forklift. Beside this affront to automotive luxury stood Arthur Vance, a man whose silence carried the heavy, unyielding density of a collapsed star. Arthur did not perform for an audience. He did not project wealth or demand attention. He was a mechanic and an aerodynamicist who had spent the last 41 months drowning the grief of his wife's terminal illness in the precise mathematical realities of fluid dynamics and tensile strength. He wore steel-toed boots, scuffed down to the composite, and a faded canvas jacket, his attention entirely consumed by a digital pyrometer aimed at the front left brake rotor of his vehicle. Standing precisely 2 feet behind Arthur was his 7-year-old son, Eli, a boy whose wide, unblinking eyes processed the absurdities of the adult world with the literal, unfiltered logic of a microchip. Eli clutched a heavy steel torque wrench in both hands, treating the tool with more reverence than Richard afforded his employees. "That man is very loud, Papa," Eli observed, his voice completely devoid of inflection as he watched Richard laugh uproariously at a joke no one else had actually found funny. "He is wasting energy," Arthur replied, his voice low, a dry rasp that barely carried over the ambient noise of the paddock, his eyes never leaving the digital readout of his instrument. Richard, catching sight of the rusted wagon out of the periphery of his surgically enhanced vision, felt a sudden, irrational spike of offense. The presence of the scrap car was a direct insult to his wealth, a visual parasite feeding on the exclusivity of his reserved tarmac. He detached himself from his sycophants, his perfectly tailored Italian suit catching the morning light, and strode across the dividing line of the paddock with the deliberate, heavy steps of a man accustomed to crushing obstacles beneath his imported leather loafers. He did not ask questions, he demanded answers. He pointed a manicured finger at the oxidized hood of the Volvo, his voice booming across the 60 feet of concrete, explicitly engineered to draw maximum public attention. "Who allowed this absolute garbage onto my staging grid? This is a private invited tier track day, not a charity drive for scrap metal collection. Get this $100 eyesore off the asphalt before I have it compacted," Richard declared, pausing precisely on the final word to allow his audience to register his performative authority. Arthur did not immediately look up, refusing to grant Richard's manufactured outrage the currency of his attention. He meticulously logged the exact surface temperature of 71.4 degrees into a battered, oil-stained notebook, capping his pen with a sharp, audible click that somehow cut through the lingering echo of Richard's shout. The Volvo, which Arthur had purchased from a Fresno salvage yard exactly 3 years, 2 months and 14 days ago for the precise sum of $112, was not a car. It was a weaponized masterclass in concealed engineering. Beneath the rusted, unpolished shell, hidden entirely from the untrained, arrogant eyes of men like Richard, lay a bespoke Inconel tube-frame chassis, hand-TIG welded in the agonizingly quiet hours between midnight and 4 in the morning when the hospital bills arrived. The suspension did not rely on standard hydraulic dampening. It utilized a proprietary, completely mechanical pushrod system that Arthur had designed, machined, and patented in his own garage, capable of dynamically adjusting camber and tow under load without a single line of electronic code. The engine was a salvaged, destroked inline-5, reinforced with forged titanium internals and mated to a sequential transaxle that shifted with the violent, terrifying efficiency of a military rifle bolt. Richard saw rust. Arthur saw a vehicle that possessed a power-to-weight ratio superior to modern fighter jets. "The man is pointing at our car, Papa. His finger is trembling slightly. He is experiencing elevated cortisol levels," Eli stated, his small hands tightening around the heavy steel shaft of the torque wrench, his assessment grounded in the medical textbooks he had read while sitting in hospital waiting rooms. Arthur finally turned, his expression as flat and unreadable as a sheet of raw slate. He did not smile. He did not frown. He looked at Richard with the clinical, detached observation of a biologist examining an invasive species of insect. "I have a valid Tier 1 track credential purchased and verified at 6:30 this morning," Arthur stated, his voice barely above a whisper, yet possessing an undeniable physical weight that forced Richard to unconsciously lean forward to hear it. "The vehicle meets all mechanical safety regulations. We are operating within our designated grid coordinates. We will not be moving until the 2 o'clock session." Richard's face flushed, a deep, ugly crimson pooling above his collar as his authority was unceremoniously dismissed by a man in a frayed jacket. He laughed, a harsh, percussive sound completely disconnected from any genuine amusement. "Safety regulations? That thing looks like it would disintegrate at 60 miles an hour. It's an insult to the engineering on this tarmac. My Apollo generates more downforce at idle than your scrap pile could survive in a vacuum." Arthur did not defend his machine. He simply stated absolute facts. "Your vehicle relies on active aero wings governed by a software suite you do not understand, generating drag coefficients that inherently limit mechanical grip. My vehicle does not." The silence that followed this exchange was not empty. It was pressurized, expanding rapidly outward from the two men and infecting the surrounding crowd of executives and mechanics. Richard Sterling, a man who built his entire empire on leveraging perceived value and aggressive posturing, recognized that he had encountered a man completely immune to his currency. The failure of his intimidation tactic demanded an immediate, overwhelming escalation to preserve his public status. "You think that rusted metal box can outperform a $4 million hypercar?" Richard demanded, his volume increasing by precisely 20 decibels, turning the private disagreement into a public spectacle. "I am on the track at 2 o'clock. If that garbage heap doesn't break down on the starting line, I will publicly humiliate you. We will run the full circuit. When I lap you within 3 miles, you will personally tow that scrap off my track and crush it yourself." Arthur did not react to the threat. He did not exhibit the nervous pacing, the defensive posturing, or the vocal justifications of a man whose ego was engaged. He simply looked at the digital clock on his wrist, noting the exact time, 8:27 in the morning. "I am not here to race you. I am here to conduct a stress test on a closed-loop pneumatic valve train system," Arthur said, prioritizing pure function over the childish demand for a competition. However, if you occupy the track during my scheduled telemetry window, you will be in my way. I suggest you monitor your carbon ceramic brake temperatures. Your rear rotors are currently exhibiting a hairline stress fracture at the mounting bell due to improper torquing by your hired mechanics. Richard's hired pit crew, a dozen men in matching, immaculately clean racing suits, stiffened collectively, their eyes darting nervously toward the Apollo's rear wheels. Richard sneered, utterly dismissing the factual warning. I pay men 6 figures to know more than a junk hauler. 2 o'clock. Prepare to be embarrassed. He turned on his heel, motioning for his entourage to follow, storming back toward his catered hospitality tent. Eli watched the procession depart, his face utterly blank. He did not check his brakes, Papa. He is ignoring empirical data. This is a primary cause of catastrophic failure. Arthur knelt down, bringing his eyes level with his son. Yes, Eli, arrogance is a highly inefficient variable. It prevents the absorption of new information. We will not worry about his variables. We will strictly manage our own. Arthur stood up and returned to the oxidized Volvo, unlatching the heavy steel hood to begin the meticulous, unglamorous process of priming the oil pump, his hands moving with the practiced absolute certainty of a master craftsman who knew that gravity and friction did not care about a man's bank account. The 3 hours and 30 minutes preceding the 2 o'clock track session were a study in extreme behavioral contrast, sharply defining the divide between performative excess and stoic competence. On the north side of the paddock, Richard Sterling's pit box was a chaotic theater of activity. 12 mechanics swarmed the Apollo hypercar, shouting contradictory telemetry readouts over the deafening manufactured roar of the V12 engine as they repeatedly, unnecessarily revved it to the red line to impress the gathering crowd of spectators. They polished the carbon fiber, applied tire warmers with frantic energy, and connected 3 separate laptops to the vehicle's diagnostic ports, creating the illusion of deep technical preparation without fundamentally altering a single mechanical variable. Richard stood at the center of this storm, holding a glass of sparkling water, speaking loudly to a documentary crew he had hired for the day, repeatedly pointing toward Arthur's pit box and making dismissive, highly choreographed hand gestures. Conversely, Arthur Vance's designated concrete square was an island of total, unnerving stillness. There were no laptops, no tire warmers, no shouting, and no sudden movements. Arthur spent precisely 45 minutes checking the torque specifications of every single suspension bolt, using a manually calibrated analog wrench, relying on the physical resistance of the metal, rather than a digital screen. He bled the hydraulic clutch line into a clear plastic bottle, observing the fluid for microscopic air bubbles with the focused intensity of a diamond cutter. At exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, Arthur produced a small, unmarked steel canister and began adjusting the preload on his custom wastegates, altering the boost pressure by exactly 2.4 pounds per square inch, based on the current barometric pressure and track surface temperature. He was not rushing. He was not performing calm. He was simply executing a sequential checklist that existed solely in his mind, forged through thousands of hours of failure and refinement. Eli sat quietly on an overturned plastic bucket, methodically eating a ham sandwich and watching the Apollo's mechanics. The men in the clean suits are putting heat into tires that will immediately lose temperature because the ambient air is cooling, Eli stated, taking a precise bite of his sandwich. They are also ignoring the structural compromise you identified on the rear rotor. Arthur nodded, wiping a single drop of synthetic oil from his thumb. They are relying on the assumption of safety built by the manufacturer. They do not understand the machine. They only operate it. When you only operate a machine, you become a victim to its limits. Arthur placed his tools carefully into a battered red metal box. Closing the lid with a definitive snap, He climbed into the driver's seat of the Volvo, a bare, stripped-out interior featuring a single carbon Kevlar racing bucket bolted directly to the inconal floor, and secured his five-point harness in total silence, the heavy click of the metal buckle signaling the end of the preparation phase. At precisely 1:58 in the afternoon, the staging marshal raised the green flag, and the two vehicles rolled toward the pit exit, their physical proximity highlighting the total absurdity of the juxtaposition. The Apollo hypercar sounded like a catastrophic seismic event, its quad titanium exhaust pipes spitting raw, unburnt fuel and blue flame as Richard aggressively blipped the throttle, desperate to dominate the auditory space. The vehicle looked like an alien spacecraft, all sharp angles and aggressive aerodynamic blades, shimmering in a custom metallic paint that cost more than Arthur's lifetime mortgage. By contrast, the oxidized Volvo moved with a heavy, purposeful menace, emitting a low, hollow, rhythmic thrum from its side exit exhaust. The sound was not loud, but it was dense, a physical vibration that rattled the rib cages of the bystanders and indicated internal combustion of terrifying, highly compressed efficiency. The vehicles aligned side by side at the start line of the 2.2-mile circuit, waiting for the electronic starting lights to cycle from red to green. Richard engaged the Apollo's sophisticated launch control system, trusting a microchip to calculate wheel slip, traction, and torque delivery, completely removing his own physical skill from the equation. He gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his jaw clenched, staring at the rust-covered wagon next to him with absolute contempt, expecting the ancient vehicle to stall or detonate the moment the clutch was released. Arthur did not use launch control. He possessed no microchips. He rested his scuff boot against the heavy mechanical clutch pedal and raised engine speed to exactly 4,800 revolutions per minute, holding the needle perfectly steady through pure, practiced muscle memory. He watched the staging lights with the cold, unblinking focus of a predator. The instant the final light extinguished, Arthur did not dump the clutch. He slipped it with microscopic, agonizing precision, feeding the exact maximum amount of torque the rear tires could sustain without breaking static friction. The Apollo's computer bogged the engine for a crucial quarter of a second, struggling to process the slight dampness on the painted starting line. Arthur's analog human calculation was flawless. The oxidized Volvo did not squeal its tires. It simply squatted back on its custom pushrod suspension, the rear bumper scraping the asphalt, and violently displaced the air around it, launching forward with the brutal, immediate kinetic energy of a fired artillery shell, leaving the $4 million hypercar exactly 1.5 car lengths behind before they even reached the first braking zone. The rapid approach to corner one, a sharp, sweeping left-hander, revealed the absolute terrifying reality of Arthur's hidden engineering. Richard, humiliated by the launch, aggressively pinned the throttle of the Apollo, relying on the immense horsepower of the V12 to close the gap on the straightaway. He approached the corner at 160 miles per hour, assuming the rusted wagon would have to brake early and hard to avoid flying off the track. Richard slammed on his carbon ceramic brakes, the active rear wing of the Apollo deploying upward to act as an air brake, the sudden deceleration pinning him violently against his harness. He expected to see the Volvo wallowing in its ancient suspension, struggling to shed speed. Instead, he witnessed an impossibility that defied his entire understanding of automotive physics. Arthur did not touch the brakes. He kept his foot pinned to the floor, maintaining a speed of 155 miles per hour as he entered the corner. The crowd in the grandstands collectively gasped, fully expecting the heavy steel wagon to understeer violently and crash into the tire barrier. But as the Volvo turned in, a massive, custom-machined internal fan system housed within the trunk activated with a high-pitched jet engine whine. The fan aggressively sucked the turbulent air out from underneath the completely flat, sealed carbon fiber underbelly of the vehicle, generating thousands of pounds of negative pressure. The car was literally sucked down onto the tarmac. The pushrod suspension dynamically shifted, cambering the wheels perfectly to counter the immense lateral G-forces. The oxidized wagon gripped the concrete like a magnetic bullet train, carving through the apex with a perfectly flat trajectory, utterly unbothered by the physics that were currently tearing at the Apollo. Richard, witnessing a junk car cornering at speeds that F1 engineers considered theoretically dangerous, panicked. He lifted off the throttle, unsettled the weight distribution of his hypercar, and induced a massive snap oversteer. The Apollo's rear end kicked out violently, the computer systems desperately cutting power and pulsing the brakes to save the car from a spin, costing Richard crucial seconds and heavily degrading his tire temperatures. By the time Richard corrected the slide and exited the corner, the rusted Volvo was already halfway down the next straight, its taillights disappearing into the heat shimmer, leaving behind nothing but the smell of burnt racing fuel and shattered ego. Standing quietly at the pit wall, entirely separated from the chaotic mob of Richard's sycophants, was Julian Thorne. Julian was a man who did not care about Italian suits or venture capital. He was a former Formula One world champion and the current chief technical director for a premier international racing conglomerate. He was not here to socialize. He was here to scout aerodynamic innovations. Julian stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto a handheld military-grade thermal imaging tablet, synchronized to the track's radar system. He watched the heat signatures of the two vehicles with the clinical intensity of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. He saw the massive thermal blooming of the Apollo's brakes, indicating chronic overheating and critical inefficiency in the cooling ducts. But when he shifted the thermal camera to the oxidized Volvo, Julian stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. The thermal signature of the wagon was almost entirely cold. The engine bay was venting heat perfectly through precisely cut, invisible louvers. But more importantly, the underbody of the vehicle showed a massive, uniform blue zone of low pressure. Julian lowered the tablet, staring down the track as the wagon navigated the technical corkscrew section with unnatural, insectoid agility. He realized with a profound, terrifying clarity exactly what he was looking at. The single dad in the scuffed, steel-toed boots had not just built a fast car, he had successfully miniaturized and perfected the Gordon Murray fan car ground effect system, a technology so overwhelmingly dominant that it had been universally banned from professional motorsport in 1978. And he had done it using analog components that required no microprocessors. The boundary layer suction is active, Julian muttered to himself, his voice thick with absolute disbelief, recognizing that the math required to balance the downforce without crushing the suspension required genius-level fluid dynamics comprehension. He looked at the telemetry numbers on his screen. The rusted scrap pile was pulling 2.6 lateral Gs on street-legal tires, a physical impossibility for a steel chassis without structural failure. Julian turned around and looked at the small boy sitting on the bucket. "Your father built a mechanical continuous variable downforce vacuum?" Julian stated, phrasing it not as a question, but as a recognition of absolute fact. Eli stopped chewing his sandwich, looking up at the highly decorated racing legend with flat, deadpan eyes. "He built it in the garage. He used parts from an industrial HVAC system. The math made him frustrated for 3 weeks, but he solved the acoustic resonance chamber to prevent cavitation." Eli explained literally, completely unaware that he had just confirmed the existence of a multi-million-dollar engineering breakthrough. Julian nodded slowly, a profound respect settling over his features. He pocketed his tablet, knowing the track session was effectively over. The climax of the physical demonstration occurred at Corner 8, a heavy braking zone at the end of the longest straight on the circuit. Richard Sterling's Apollo, desperate to regain ground, was pushing 190 miles per hour. Richard's vision was tunneled, his entire psychological state consumed by the absolute humiliation of being outpaced by a man he had publicly degraded. His ego completely overrode his logic. He ignored the flashing red warning light on his dashboard indicating critical brake fade. He ignored the spongy, unresponsive feel of the brake pedal. He decided to outbrake the Volvo, attempting to dive down the inside line at the absolute last microsecond. It was a maneuver driven entirely by arrogance rather than skill. Arthur, approaching the same corner in the Volvo, had already calculated the exact heat saturation point of the Apollo's carbon ceramic rotors, based on the visual smoke he had observed 3 corners prior. Arthur braked exactly at the 150-meter board, a smooth, deliberate transfer of weight that kept his chassis perfectly balanced. Richard bypassed the board, slamming his foot onto the brake pedal at the 50-meter mark. The Apollo's rear right rotor, suffering from the microscopic stress fracture Arthur had pointed out 45 minutes earlier, finally experienced catastrophic thermal shock. The carbon ceramic disc shattered instantly, violently exploding into 1,000-degree shrapnel that shredded the inner wheel well and severed the hydraulic brake line. The Apollo instantly lost all stopping power on the right side, jerking violently across the track in a terrifying, uncontrolled slide. Arthur did not flinch. He did not panic. His hands moved with absolute, unthinking precision, adding exactly 5 degrees of steering angle to tighten his line by exactly 18 inches, creating a flawless geometric gap as the $4 million hypercar spun wildly out of control mere inches from his bumper. The Apollo spun 3 times, tires screaming in agony, before burying itself deep into the gravel trap, a massive cloud of dust completely swallowing the gleaming carbon fiber. Arthur smoothly accelerated out of the corner, upshifting with a heavy metallic clack, the Volvo continuing its lap with unbothered metronomic consistency. Back in the pits, the documentary crew filmed the entire disaster in brutal high definition. Eli watched the dust settle on the monitor with his characteristic blank expression. He forgot to turn. Also, his car is broken now. He was warned about the structural compromise. Eli stated plainly, offering no sympathy for the avoidable destruction born of extreme arrogance. By the time Arthur returned to the pit lane and precisely parked the oxidized Volvo back in its designated square, Richard Sterling had already abandoned his wrecked vehicle to the track marshals and stormed back to the paddock, his suit covered in fine white dust, his face contorted in a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He was screaming at his head mechanic, wildly threatening lawsuits and demanding immediate termination, entirely incapable of accepting personal responsibility for the catastrophic failure. Arthur ignored the screaming CEO completely. He turned off the ignition, the massive internal vacuum fan winding down with a slow, dying whistle. He unbuckled his harness, stepped out of the vehicle, and immediately checked the tire pressure, prioritizing the health of the machine over the drama of the humans. It was in this moment of quiet, absolute stoicism that Julian Thorne crossed the dividing line of the paddock, bypassing the screaming billionaire and walking directly toward the man in the scuffed boots. Julian did not offer a handshake. He understood that men like Arthur valued time and data over pleasantries. The telemetry data from the track sensors logged your lateral G-force at 2.6. You are running a naturally aspirated engine, but your manifold pressure indicates a forced induction system driven entirely by exhaust scavenging, bypassing turbo lag entirely, Julian stated, his voice calm, projecting the quiet authority of absolute expertise. You have solved the acoustic resonance issue that caused the 1978 Brabham fan car to vibrate itself to pieces, and you have entirely mechanically linked the downforce generation to the suspension load, eliminating the need for active electronic yaw control. Arthur paused his pressure check, looking up at the pro driver. He did not feign humility or shock. The resonance is stabilized by a counter-rotating baffle plate constructed from salvaged titanium turbine blades, Arthur confirmed simply, verifying the exact nature of his hidden genius. Julian nodded once, his eyes flicking to the rusted exterior of the car and back to Arthur. My conglomerate has spent $85 million over the last 4 years attempting to stabilize a boundary layer suction system for our Le Mans hypercar class. Our engineers failed. You succeeded in a garage with scrap metal. I am offering you $5 million. That covers the immediate, outright purchase of the vehicle chassis, the exclusive rights to the mechanical suspension patents, and a 2-year retainer as a remote aerodynamic consultant. I will write the contract immediately. The funds will be wired into an escrow account within 24 hours. The absolute staggering weight of the number hung in the air, a hard, undeniable metric of true value, completely obliterating the performative wealth Richard Sterling had attempted to wield. Richard Sterling, having overheard the exact dollar amount of the offer, abruptly stopped screaming at his mechanics. His jaw slackened, all the color draining from his face as he stared at Julian Thorne, a man whose net worth and industry influence dwarfed his own by an order of magnitude. $5 million? Julian, you cannot be serious? That is a junkyard Volvo? It's a trick. The telemetry must be glitched, Richard stammered, stepping forward, desperately trying to insert his ego back into a transaction where it had absolutely no currency. Julian did not even turn his head to look at Richard. He simply raised one hand, a sharp, dismissive gesture that carried the absolute weight of a superior intellect shutting down a nuisance. Richard, you just totaled a $4 million catalog car because you lack the basic mechanical sympathy to understand thermal dynamics. Do not speak on matters of engineering in my presence, Julian commanded, his tone completely flat, stripping Richard of his remaining dignity in front of his own board members. The paddock went completely agonizingly silent as the truth of the power dynamic settled. Arthur did not gloat. He did not smile at Richard's humiliation. He looked at the rusted hood of the machine that had consumed his grief, and then he looked down at Eli, who was meticulously organizing the socket set back into the red metal box. $5 million was not a victory lap. It was the absolute guarantee of Eli's future, a university education, a safe neighborhood, and an end to the crushing, silent anxiety of overdue bills. Arthur turned back to Julian, his expression remaining as stoic and unyielding as the inconel frame he had welded. The patents are clearly drafted. The documentation is in the glove compartment. I will accept the $5 million, but I am keeping the engine block. It belonged to my wife's first car, Arthur stated, dictating the final terms with the quiet, authoritative power of a man who held all the leverage. Julian nodded immediately. Agreed. My transport team will load the chassis within the hour. Arthur knelt down, placing a heavy, calloused hand on his son's shoulder. Pack the tools, Eli. We are going home. They did not wait for the transport team. They did not say goodbye to Richard Sterling, leaving the CEO standing silently in the dust of his own shattered arrogance. They simply picked up the red metal box, turned their backs on the billionaires, and walked quietly out of the paddock, leaving behind the greatest feat of hidden engineering the track had ever witnessed.